Toonami and Adult Swim are often credited for introducing an entire generation to shows like they had never seen before. For kids growing up in the US in the 90s and 2000s, these programming blocks gave them shows like Cowboy Bebop, Outlaw Star, and Evangelion, just to name a few. They were radical and mind-blowing, expanding kids' ideas of what animation could do and could be. But not every show from that time is so fondly remembered. Some just sort of fell by the wayside, only to live in the back of people's minds as a distant memory. Which brings us to a little show called Android Kikaider. I'd say that when it comes to Kikaider, people, at least in the US, fall into a few camps. One, they have absolutely no idea who or what this is. Or two, they are vaguely aware of the character, probably through the show on Adult Swim. There are outliers to this, of course, small niche communities that know him through the broader genre he falls into, and we'll get to that, but generally speaking, I think this character has basically faded into obscurity. But not for another not so insignificant group. This group is very much aware of Kikaider's existence, and they cringe at the sound of me saying his name. Because as obscure as this character is, he's impacted a lot more people's lives than you'd expect. He's actually one of the most influential fictional characters in my life. And I'd argue that in the US, for a brief moment in time, he was one of the most popular foreign imports ever to be put on TV. – 2003, Finding Nemo, Return of the King, Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, Coldplay is on tour, and on Monday, June 9th, Android Kikaider premieres on Adult Swim. The show was originally released in 2000 from Studio Radix, an adaptation of the Android Kikaider manga by Shotaro Ishinomori. If you don't know who Ishinomori is, he's the creator of some very influential properties and characters, but we'll put a pin in that for now. The Android Kikaider manga was published in Weekly Shonen Sunday over 6 volumes, 5 for the digital version, which is what I read and what I'll be referencing for comparisons. Now, before I get into anything else, I should probably explain what this show is because given how little I've seen in terms of people talking about Kikaider, I'm pretty convinced that no one remembers this show or even knows it exists. Android Kikaider is the story of Jiro, a powerful android created by Dr. Komyoji to fight against an organization known as Dark, headed by the evil Professor Gill. Professor Gill has a special electric flute which he uses to control and send orders to androids, and he plans on taking over the world. To combat this, Komyoji created Jiro with a special conscience circuit which gives him the ability to resist the orders of Dark and Gill should he fall into their hands. However, before Komyoji can complete the conscience circuit, Dark destroys his lab, seemingly killing Komyoji in the process, but not before he releases Jiro into the world. With no memory of who or what he is, Jiro must destroy Dark and protect Dr. Komyoji's children, Mitsuko and Masaru, as the titular blue and red hero, Kikaider. I've simplified the premise a bit here, but these are elements both the show and manga share, with only minor differences between them. It's part Pinocchio, part Frankenstein, with a bit of iRobot mixed in there for good measure. And Ishinomori is as far away as humanly possible when it comes to being subtle about any of this. Running an experiment in a creepy lab during a thunderstorm to signify that the thing Dr. Komyoji is making could be a monster? Yup. Quoting Isaac Asimov's 3 Laws of Robotics to showcase how complex Jiro is as an android, of course. Having a character read Pinocchio out loud to draw parallels between the stories and naming the conscience circuit Jiminy to really drive that point home, why not? Although that last part is only true in the manga. Subtle is not a word I would use to describe android Kikaider. What I would say is that the story was pretty ahead of its time. And while it doesn't seem that way considering that the story is a dark, moody, and borderline edgy sci-fi about androids, which seems very much in line with the trends of the 90s and early 2000s, it's worth noting that the manga was initially released in 1972, which I'm told was a very long time ago. The central theme Kikaider explores is that of human nature, Ishinomori using androids, something very much not human, to dissect and interrogate very human struggles, exploring questions like what gives life value, what does it mean to have a soul. On his journey to destroy Dark and protect Mitsuko and Masaru, Jiro's interactions with others informs his own values. He makes memories, forms relationships, all things that allow him to feel more human than machine. Jiro's conscience circuit giving him the ability to decide for himself the things worth protecting. And this is where the main conflict for the story comes from. In its incomplete state, the conscience circuit allows Jiro to resist orders from Dark, but not completely. Professor Gill's flute constantly tempts Jiro to commit, what are to put it bluntly, atrocities. At more than one point, Jiro almost strangles Mitsuko to death, and in another, Jiro goes on a rampage in the city, although that one wasn't on Gill's orders specifically, instead coming from another character with similar goals. It's a very simplified and exaggerated version of how I guess Ishinomori views the human experience, a struggle between doing what you believe is right and the temptation to do something you know is bad. The two-tone color scheme of Kikaider's appearance even mirroring that struggle. And that's not me reading between the lines or anything, Ishinomori spells all of this out in the manga. Again, the story is not subtle. But this struggle is more or less what gives the entire story its structure, with every interaction here serving to further explore Jiro's psyche and morality. Stripped down to its most basic parts, the show is a psychological thriller. While I don't think it's that necessary for me to go over every detail that happens here, I do think it's worth at least exploring some of the characters and interactions that showcase the goals of this adaptation. And we'll start with the villain, Golden Bat. Golden Bat is one of Dark's androids, and on Professor Gill's orders, he kidnaps Mitsuko in the hopes of drawing Jiro out of hiding. But what makes Golden Bat interesting is that, like Jiro, he was also equipped with a conscience circuit, albeit a very early prototype. In this state, Golden Bat has the ability to form his own opinions. He can distinguish between good and evil, but lacks the capacity to act on those opinions once an order is given by Professor Gill. And this tortures Golden Bat, who is literally cursed with knowledge. He knows that the things he's being asked to do are wrong, but is constantly compelled to follow orders with no say in the matter. Golden Bat, I think, is obviously meant to be a reflection of Jiro. He embodies the temptation Jiro feels to act on his worst instincts and the pain he would experience should he succumb to them. And what I really like about this character is how the story frames their encounter. Golden Bat doesn't offer Jiro a chance to join Dark. He's pretty straightforward in saying that he's been ordered to destroy him. Instead, what Golden Bat offers is far darker and bleak. Because of his conscience circuit, Golden Bat is one of the few characters who understands the nature of Jiro's pain, what it feels like to be torn apart from the inside by temptation, and the feelings of guilt and remorse that follow. What Golden Bat offers then is a chance at relief. I, more than anyone, understand your pain. Let me set you free. This is a place where I think the show actually improves on the source material. While Golden Bat is equipped with a conscience circuit in both, he's portrayed as a much more tragic figure in the show. You can even read some of his comically evil behavior as a way for him to cope with his guilt, the seemingly gleeful attitude he has when doing terrible things being the result of cognitive dissonance, as a person forced to do things against their will for most of their existence. And they even give him what I think is a much more fitting ending in the show. Instead of just being defeated by Jiro in a fight, Golden Bat actually sacrifices himself to save Mitsuko's life. Something that's made quite clear throughout his episodes is that he doesn't have any ill will towards Mitsuko. He actually feels kind of bad about kidnapping her. So when Mitsuko is put in harm's way, and with no orders to do otherwise, Golden Bat, in the briefest of moments, acts on his own. He gives up his own life to do something he truly believes. I don't really know what that says, or even if this was meant to symbolize anything, but I at least think it's a fitting ending for such a tragic figure. The next characters I want to mention are Kaito, Kuya, and Riku, a pair of twin androids and a bear. When they're introduced, they do seem like filler. Like most of the other android villains, they don't have a conscience circuit, and in the show they end up feeling a bit like a villain of the week. But I think they pose an interesting question. With Golden Bat, his conscience circuit made him experience guilt, and his struggles came from reckoning with those emotions. Jiro experiences the same things. Like I said, I think these characters are meant to mirror each other. But that just isn't the case with these three. They don't have a conscience circuit. They don't feel remorse. They embody the opposite of being cursed with knowledge. They live in ignorant bliss. And it makes you wonder, would Jiro have been better off if he were made the same way? Would Jiro be happier without his conscience circuit? These characters aren't completely heartless though. They still have emotions and have the ability to form relationships. In their episode, they help Masaru find Jiro and Mitsuko when he gets lost in the woods, eventually considering Masaru as a friend. They even share a special bond with each other. They were created together as a set. One android split into three. They rely on each other and can even combine together when they fight. They are, for all intents and purposes, a family. The only thing they lack are guilt and remorse. And what we see with them are that even as painful as those emotions are, they can be useful. They keep Jiro from acting against his own interests. When Gil orders these three to fight Jiro, they do so without any hesitation. Again, they don't feel bad about this, but the tragic part is that they just can't comprehend the consequences of what they're being asked to do. Fighting almost certainly means their destruction. It means throwing away every bond they have, their friendship with Masaru, and even their own family. Jiro doesn't want to fight them. Masaru begs them to stop. For everyone else, it's easy to see and understand how worse off everyone will be if they fight. But without a conscience circuit, without guilt or remorse to hold them back, Kaito, Kuya, and Riku follow Gil blindly. Jiro inevitably defeats them, but just before they're completely destroyed, we see the twins use what little power they have left to try and hold each other, terrified of losing one another. All the more tragic because even as they die, they never even consider the possibility that if they had a choice, none of this would have happened. Finally, let's talk a little bit about Saburo, also known as Kikaider. Kikaider is the Joker, the Green Goblin, the Lex Luthor of the story. Working under Professor Gil, he was created for the sole purpose of destroying Kikaider. Kikaider himself doesn't have a conscience circuit, but he does have free will, and all his actions are of his own choosing. He takes delight in tormenting Jiro and even has the ability to control him by whistling, just like Professor Gil's flute. He's actually the one that caused Kikaider to go on a rampage in the city. So, in no uncertain terms, Kikaider is a bad guy. He's a figure for Jiro to absolutely despise. And yet, he's someone Jiro is hesitant to kill. Not because Jiro thinks there might be some good in him, but because despite his appearances as an android, Kikaider, in a delightfully melodramatic twist, is actually a cyborg powered by Dr. Komyoji's brain. The brain is just a power source though, so Komyoji can't influence Kikaider, but this means that as long as Kikaider isn't destroyed, Dr. Komyoji can be brought back, at least within the logic of the story. And therein lies the problem for Jiro. Should he kill Kikaider to save himself and the people he loves, or should he allow Kikaider to exist, risking everyone on the chance it could save Dr. Komyoji? That might seem like a one-sided question. Dr. Komyoji is basically dead, so what's the harm in killing Kikaider at this point? But remember, Komyoji is a scientist. He can make more androids. Androids that could stop Dark altogether. As long as Kikaider stays alive, there's a chance that a lot of innocent lives could be saved. It's a sort of trolley problem presented as a villain, the ultimate test of Jiro's conscience. Is saving Dr. Komyoji worth the risk? Whose lives are worth saving? It's an interesting question, one that the show doesn't actually bother to ask, because it turns out Komyoji does have some amount of influence on Kikaider and eventually takes control of him. And at the end of the show, Kikaider sneaks Jiro into Dark headquarters, they recover Komyoji's brain, and the entire facility blows up from the inside, killing Professor Gill. And if you expect for the manga to do things differently, no, it's largely the same. The show changes the order of some things and some events are compressed for time, but overall, how the show wraps up is pretty much in line with what happens at the end of Volume 3. But, you might have noticed, there are still 2 other volumes of Kikaider left. And those volumes were adapted into the 4-episode Kikaider 01 OVA. This is kind of outside the scope of what I want to talk about, but man, this thing goes in a completely different direction from here on out. Pretty much every character from the earlier part of the story becomes irrelevant and is almost entirely forgotten about, instead focusing on the previously unmentioned Kikaider family, including Kikaider, Kikaider 01, and Kikaider 00, new androids like Mieko, Rieko, and Waruder, and now an entire squad of Kikaiders because, surprise, Professor Gill didn't actually die in the explosion. He and some of his lackeys had their brains transplanted into Kikaider bodies before Dark was destroyed, somehow, and all of these groups, along with a new evil organization called Shadow, are after the never once referenced before this point children of Professor Gill, Akira, and Rumi, who are the keys to an all-powerful doomsday machine. And if that seems like a lot to throw in with 2 volumes left, it kind of is. And while the OVA does its best to compress all of that plot into 4 episodes, the results are mixed. These last 2 volumes are bonkers. The final pages of the story are honestly shocking and downright depressing, so much so that it'll make you wonder if Ishinomori believes that to be human is to endlessly suffer. So that should give you a basic understanding of how things play out in Android Kikaider, or at least the show, which is pretty faithful to the source material. Most of the changes in this adaptation come from shuffling around certain events and attempting to make the tone of the story a bit more consistent. But all that aside, why talk about this show? Was it some overlooked gem or this cult commodity that quietly had massive influence? Well, in my opinion, not really. I don't want to leave you with the impression that the show was any sort of masterpiece. It's not. And judging by the reviews of this thing, not a lot of people think so either, with opinions ranging from it's fine to not that great. Even though the source material was fairly ahead of its time, it's hard to escape the feeling that this show was trying to cash in on some of the trends present at the time it aired. And that's a lot more apparent with a property like Kikaider because of some of the inherent goofiness baked into the source material. The art style, which is lifted directly from the manga, is kind of at odds with the tone the show is going for. Things like Jiro's red guitar, an iconic part of the character, very much feels like an afterthought that just had to be there because it was present in the manga. And of course, there's the fact that Jiro does this whole thing to transform into Kikaider that feels pretty out of place in a story that tries to take itself so seriously. The 2014 live-action reboot of the franchise, which loosely adapts the original manga and again focuses on the darker aspects of the story, runs into the exact same problems, with the exception of the tonally inconsistent art style. These are just things that any adaptation of Kikaider are gonna have to contend with in one way or another. I'm not saying that these things are inherently bad or that I dislike them. I don't. I'm just saying that finding a place for things like this can be difficult depending on the nature of the adaptation. But that does beg the question, why is Kikaider like this in the first place? And that's a valid question. And the answer, I think, is intimately tied to the legacy of Kikaider. And to understand that legacy, we need to look at the story behind the manga, its creator Shotaro Ishinomori, and the genre he helped pioneer. Shotaro Onodera was born on January 25, 1938. From an early age, Onodera took an interest in literature and was introduced to the world of manga with Shin Takarajima, a series based off of the novel Treasure Island by the legendary Osamu Tezuka. Throughout his childhood, he started creating his own works, submitting some of them to local newspapers, and eventually in middle school, he managed to have one of his submissions published in the popular magazine Manga Shonen under the pen name Shotaro Ishinomori. Or at least, that's what a lot of people thought his name was. His pen name was based off the town he lived in, and the kanji is apparently quite easy to misread, so later in life he added an extra character to avoid any confusion. But this is the origin story of Shotaro Ishinomori, one of the most prolific and influential figures in manga. At the age of 15, he was the assistant to his childhood hero, Osamu Tezuka, the god of manga, helping him with Astro Boy at the request of Tezuka himself. In 1956, Ishinomori moved to Tokyo and lived in Tokiwaso, an apartment complex that became famous for housing and hosting many up-and-coming manga artists of the 1950s, including, but not limited to, Osamu Tezuka, the comedy duo Fujiko Fujio, creators of the massively popular Doraemon, and Fujio Akatsuka, creator of the famous gag manga Osomatsu-kun, and one of Ishinomori's closest friends. And all of these artists, as influential as they were, saw Ishinomori as a force of nature. He helped define the visual grammar of modern shoujo manga with works like Angel in the Dark in 1958, under the pen name Yumiya, which was a collaboration between Ishinomori, Akatsuka, and Hideko Mizuno, another Tokiwaso resident. In 1964, he created Cyborg 009, one of the most influential sci-fi mangas, a staple of the genre, and arguably one of Ishinomori's most enduring and well-known works in Japan. If Osamu Tezuka was the god of manga, then Ishinomori was the king. Throughout his life, he created over 700 individual stories, for which he was posthumously given the Guinness World Record for most comics published by one author. Although the math on that is kind of shaky. Needless to say, Ishinomori did and accomplished a lot. His life story is fascinating and at times tragic. I think it's definitely worth looking into if you have the time. But to understand Kikaider, we need to look at a series he created in 1971. For some context, in 1966, a little show began to air that would change Japanese TV forever. It was a spin-off of the popular Ultra Q series, and it was called Ultraman. Ultraman was an instant success, capturing the hearts and minds of the people in Japan. The show is a staple of tokusatsu, a genre whose roots lie in kabuki theater and rely heavily on special effects. Think classic Godzilla. Ultraman became a cultural phenomenon practically overnight in Japan, and in 1971, he was getting a sequel, The Return of Ultraman. As the story goes, the people at Toei also wanted to get in on this trend. They wanted their own hero, one that could rival the likes of Ultraman, and they hired Ishinomori to make one. He would create the character's concept and manga, and Toei would make the show. Originally, the plan was to adapt one of Ishinomori's other works, Skullman, but that proved to be difficult. It was a bit too scary and dark for what was envisioned as a show for kids. So they made some adjustments here and there, even taking input from Ishinomori's son, Joe. The result was a story about a man kidnapped and turned into a cyborg, fighting against an organization bent on taking over the world while also fighting for his own innocence, as a man framed for murder. The story of a transforming hero with a wind turbine belt. The story of Takeshi Hongo, the very first Kamen Rider. To all the Kamen Rider superfans out there, yes, I know Takeshi isn't the only Kamen Rider that appears in this first series, but we're not getting into that. Kamen Rider is one of Ishinomori's most well-known properties outside of Japan, and like Ultraman before him, Kamen Rider became a staple of tokusatsu in his own right. The series marked the beginning of what many consider to be the henshin boom on Japanese TV in the 70s. Shows about people that would pose, say a phrase, and transform into superheroes. And Kamen Rider wasn't the only hero series Ishinomori helped create in this time. There was Henshin Ninja Arashi in 1972, Inazuman and Robot Detective in 1973, and Himitsu Sentai Goranger in 1975, the first entry in the Super Sentai series, better known in the US as Power Rangers, the other series Ishinomori is famous for outside of Japan. And just like with Kamen Rider, for each of these series, Ishinomori made the manga and Toei made the show. You can start to see how Ishinomori got that world record. Although it is kind of a shame that most people only know Ishinomori through these works, because he was extremely talented in all sorts of genres. Like I said, he helped define the modern shoujo manga and was at the bleeding edge of science fiction. But I do think the fact that people remember him for his work with so-called henshin heroes shows just how much influence he had in that space. And you can still feel the effects of those works to this day. A big influence for Sailor Moon was Super Sentai. And yeah, Sailor Moon is basically Super Sentai with schoolgirls, meaning Ishinomori was indirectly responsible for the magical girl genre as we know it today. Ishinomori didn't create the idea of a transforming superhero, but he certainly helped to push that idea forward, and Kikaider was one of the characters that helped to do just that. He was another hero Ishinomori made as part of the larger henshin hero craze in the 70s, and like all the others, Kikaider had his own show, a live-action tokusatsu series that aired in 1972. Jinzo Ningen Kikaida. If you're a big fan of tokusatsu, you might know Kikaider, and this show is probably how. It was another tokusatsu that Ishinomori helped create, another piece within the larger tokusatsu canon. But this show in particular has a very interesting relationship to the US. In general, I think most people outside of Japan were introduced to tokusatsu and henshin heroes with Saban's Power Rangers, an adaptation of Ishinomori's Super Sentai made for American audiences. Although, calling it an adaptation feels a bit weird. As most people know, the way Power Rangers adapted Super Sentai was that it took parts of one of the Super Sentai shows, dubbed over it in English, and spliced it together with footage from English actors. The end result was, essentially, a new show, with different stories and characters, with the only similarities between them being the costumes and action. Super Sentai purists might even take some offense to me equating these two shows. And to be fair, they really aren't the same in any meaningful way. But like I said, for most people, this was their first exposure to tokusatsu and henshin heroes. When Power Rangers was released in 1993 on Fox Kids, it was a cultural force in America as much as Kamen Rider was in Japan. So, it shouldn't come as a shock that Saban tried to do the same thing with Kamen Rider. Saban's Masked Rider from 1995 attempted to apply the same Power Rangers formula to Kamen Rider. And if you didn't know this thing existed, well, that's because there was only one season, and from everything I've read, it's apparently very, very bad. Personally, I haven't seen the show, so I won't say any more about this. So, why does this matter? Well, when talking about the Kikaider tokusatsu, I think it's worth mentioning Saban's Power Rangers and Masked Rider to lay the groundwork for how people view these kinds of shows outside of Japan. From everything I've seen, outside of very niche communities, it's very difficult to bring tokusatsu shows to the US and make them popular. They appeal to aesthetic sensibilities and trends that just aren't as prominent outside of Japan. It might be tempting to think that all you need to do to bring these properties over is sub or dub them in English and call it a day. These are good shows. But it's just not that simple. Ultraman, the quintessential tokusatsu series, was dubbed and broadcast in America in 1968. And while it did gain a cult following, the property never reached the same heights as it did in Japan. For what it's worth, Saban's attempt to Frankenstein a show together, splicing Super Sentai action with hyper-localized English scenes, worked in spades. And while that formula isn't a guaranteed success, again, see Masked Rider, Power Rangers is still airing. There's no doubt in my mind that if Ultraman reached the same level of popularity, we'd have an English version of the show today. Not a dub, a proper adaptation made specifically for an audience outside of Japan. And this is what makes the Android Kikaider tokusatsu so interesting, and a bit of an oddity when it comes to henshin heroes in the US. But first, I want to talk about this version of the show for a bit because I watched all 43 episodes, took a lot of notes, and I really don't want that to go to waste. This show is, first and foremost, made for kids. It leans heavily into the inherent goofiness of the concept and is generally an episodic villain of the week kind of show. It's still somewhat serialized though, with the show very loosely adapting the first 3 volumes of the manga. Although, I need to add a bit of a disclaimer on that statement because I don't actually know which version of the story came first. The release of the manga coincided with the release of the tokusatsu. It could be the case that the show loosely followed whatever Ishinomori laid out if the manga was planned ahead of time. But it's also possible that Ishinomori tried to create a cohesive serial manga from what was in the show. There's very little information I could find about the behind the scenes for either of these things, so I can't be certain what actually happened. In this version of the story, Jiro was created by Dr. Komyoji to fight Dark, but this time with help from Mitsuko, who is also a scientist. And when their lab is destroyed and Jiro is released, he is very much aware that he's an android and what that means. The person running around not knowing who they are is Dr. Komyoji, who survived the attack and now has amnesia. Most of the B-plot for these episodes revolves around Mitsuko and Masaru trying to find their father. In general, Mitsuko and Masaru are much bigger players in this version of the story. Another character who has a bigger presence is the private detective, Hattori Hanpei, a character I didn't mention earlier but who is still present in the 2000 show and the manga. Here, he's the comic relief character, and I love him. This guy spends like a good 10 seconds licking a car at one point, and sometimes he can inexplicably perform magic. He can do jutsus, ones that fix a flat tire or undo some really tight knots. And this isn't something anyone else in the show can do, it's just him, and none of the other characters seem to care. Villains from the 2000 show and manga are also present but given their own dedicated episodes, and some are slightly adjusted. This rhino, ant, and praying mantis are the same as their manga counterparts but given their own unique subplots. Golden Bat is here with a very similar backstory as before, prototype Conscience Circuit and all, but for some reason, this version is named Golden Wolf, who is an android werewolf. The twins in Bear are translated as this android anteater father and son duo, or at least I'm pretty sure these are supposed to be somewhat equivalent. And of course, Saburo, Kikaider, is here. Although, the show actually does something kind of interesting with him. He's still a cyborg with Dr. Komyoji's brain created for the sole purpose of destroying Kikaider, but unlike any of the other iterations of him, Kikaider never becomes influenced by Dr. Komyoji and remains a villain all the way until he's destroyed. He's still one of the main reasons why Dark gets defeated in the final part of the show, but it's for entirely different reasons. Because, in a pretty surprising turn of events, Kikaider essentially dies at the hand of some random villain in the last few episodes. He gets blown to pieces. He gets put back together eventually, but before that happens, Kikaider has a complete mental breakdown. He goes on a rampage in Dark headquarters and destroys almost everything, fueled by existential dread at the loss of his purpose for existing and determined to kill everyone responsible for creating him. That is shockingly deep for a show aimed at kids. And if you ask me, it's actually a bit more interesting compared to what happens in the manga. Those are just some of the more interesting differences between these two versions of the story. But going back to the tokusatsu, there's actually something pretty notable about how the show was presented when it was released in the US. It wasn't repackaged like Super Sentai, and unlike Ultraman, there is no English dub. Kikaider was released in Japanese with English subtitles, and those subtitles are a bit quirky. In some places, lines of dialogue are just not translated. It isn't that big of a deal though, the missing lines aren't super important. But by far, the weirdest part about this translation is the fact that Kikaider's name isn't properly localized. For whatever reason, the translators opted to Romanize or use the Japanese pronunciation of Kikaider as the English name. So, in the official English release of this show, which keep in mind is the only version you can buy in the US, this character isn't actually named Kikaider. It's Kikaida. The same thing happens again later in the show with Kikaider, where his name is translated as Kikaida. I couldn't find any information on why this is, but my best guess is that when this translation was made, there might not have been an official localization for these names yet. And when one was decided on later, the translators didn't go back to update the subtitles since the show was already in print. Again, I have no idea if this is what happened, but that's my guess. Aside from the quirky translation though, what's the big deal? There are a lot of foreign shows today that you can watch or buy without an English dub, which is true, but no matter how you feel about English dubs, they make these shows more accessible to American audiences. That's just how it is, and that's especially true for shows on broadcast TV. Because yes, this show aired on TV in the US, subtitles and all, and it first aired all the way back in 1974. Kikaider was one of the earliest tokusatsu shows to air in the US. You might be thinking that this is probably the result of some technicality, that it must have only aired to a few hundred people in a niche market. And if that's what you think, then you might be surprised to learn that when Kikaider aired, it became very popular very, very quickly. After it debuted in the US in February 1974, it started taking 25% of the total viewership in markets where it aired. To give you some context for what that means, Chico and the Man was the third highest rated TV program in the US in 1974, according to Nielsen. And this wildly popular show, which was being watched by millions of people across the US, was being beat out by Kikaider, which shared the same time slot in markets that aired both. So yeah, Kikaider, which again is a show made for kids in a completely different country, was pretty popular, and you could see the effects of that popularity in person. When the actors for the show made appearances in the US, it caused riots. Kikaider's stage shows at local fairs led to traffic jams. At an autograph signing event in August 1974, 10,000 people showed up to a mall that was woefully unprepared for the crowd. They completely overtook the entire place and caused a fire hazard. Kikaider is the reason for the crowd in this very blurry photo, all because parents and kids wanted to get an autograph of actors in a show that had only been airing for a few months at that point. And if you really want proof that this show was in the mainstream, there are pictures of Kikaider meeting and shaking hands with state governors. In the era before the internet, Kikaider was a sensation, and people wanted more. The company that bought the US distribution rights for the Kikaider series also ended up buying them for other Ishinomori properties directly as a result of the show's success. Kikaider 01, the 1973 sequel series to Kikaider, Inazuman, and most notably, Kamen Rider. Because Saban's Masked Rider wasn't the first time the character appeared in the US. It was actually in the series Kamen Rider V3, which first aired to US audiences in 1975. As far as I can tell, Kikaider gave rise to one of the earliest waves of tokusatsu fans in the US. All that being said, there's a question that's been lingering over this entire discussion. If Kikaider was so popular, why isn't he more widely remembered? I've left out a pretty key piece of information so far. Everything I've said is true, but if you thought that the show only aired to a niche market, you'd be right. There was a large but niche market in the 70s that was more than willing to accept shows like Kikaider, and that happened to be the only place in the US the show aired to in 1974. Hawaii, which is where I grew up. I'm gonna let you in on a little secret. Until I started working on this video, I don't think I've ever watched a single episode of Kikaida. Just so we're clear, I wasn't alive when the tokusatsu aired in 1974, and I had no idea that an animated version of the show even existed. I've only experienced Kikaida through cultural osmosis, and fun fact, because of the quirky subtitles in the show, everyone who knows Kikaida in Hawaii only knows him as Kikaida with the original Japanese pronunciation. That thing in the beginning where I said saying Kikaider's name makes people cringe is mostly for people like me, because every bone in my body has been telling me that throughout this whole video, I've been saying that name wrong. As an aside, and this is gonna be a bit of a PSA, please don't call people Hawaiian just because they live or are from Hawaii. It's not offensive or anything, and I get where that comes from, but Hawaiian is a pretty specific term. When doing research for this thing, I came across quite a few articles that used Hawaiian to mean Hawaii resident, and while I don't want to get too into the weeds about this, just know that those are not the same. I think most people who grew up in Hawaii will say that being called Hawaiian when they aren't feels small kind weird. So that's just my little PSA. Anyways, you remember that Kikaida reboot movie I mentioned in the beginning? Did you know it had a North American premiere? Well, it did, on October 10th, 2014 in, you guessed it, Honolulu, Hawaii. Here's a picture of Ban Daisuke, the actor for Jiro in the tokusatsu, at the event. If Hawaii didn't have such a close connection to Kikaida, this never would have happened. And I certainly don't think Ban Daisuke would have showed up. If you're wondering who this is though, she's not just some random person. Her name is Joanne Ninomiya, and she's basically the reason why any of this happened in the first place. In 1972, on a trip to Japan, she happened to catch an episode of Kikaida that was airing. Back then, she was the general manager for the local Hawaii station, Kiku TV. And immediately after watching the show, she began negotiations to bring it to Hawaii, which she eventually did. And that decision single-handedly changed the lives of Hawaii kids in the 70s. And after seeing the show for myself, it's not hard to see why. It was fun and playful in a way that's sometimes hard to capture, with outlandish creatures and ridiculous plots, all delivered with such a warmth. The best way for me to describe the experience of watching the show is that it feels like watching a kid playing pretend with a loving older sibling. a sibling who knows just how absurd the situations being created are, but embraces them just to have fun. That loving warmth is what I'd imagine kids who grew up watching Kikaida felt. At least that's the vibe I got from the many interviews I read and watched through. But I don't share their experience. I can't look back fondly on a show I've never watched. But that doesn't change the fact that this show still had an impact on me. Kikaida quietly existed in the background for all of my life. He was a character I knew but never thought about. He wasn't as popular when I grew up as he was back in the 70s, and that's even more true today, but I still remember seeing posters of him in malls, figures of him in stores. Bandaisuke was still showing up at events. I didn't watch the show, but that didn't matter. For a time, Kikaida was a household name, a staple of Hawaii pop culture. I don't even remember learning about Kikaida. As far as I knew, he was always there. And because he was, I saw this obscure character who I knew came from another country, this foreign import, as a regular superhero, just like Spider-Man or Superman. That, I think, speaks to the power that media has to shape our perception of the world just through its presence and existence. It can be easy to overlook and discount the effects media has on our lives. Pointing out that I grew up seeing Kikaida this way doesn't seem like it'd be worth saying, but that isn't what I think is notable. The notable thing is the fact that I didn't eventually come to see him as a superhero. That was something I never questioned in the first place. The kind of acceptance that comes from growing up around media filled with all kinds of characters from different parts of the world is practically invisible. You end up taking it for granted because nothing about it seems strange or foreign at all. And while I think it would be ridiculous for me to try to point to any part about who I am today and say that the reason for it is because of Kikaida, the fact that I cringed when I heard the name Kikaider when doing research for this video, because up until that point, I had never actually heard his name properly localized, means that on some level, his presence in my life did have some kind of effect on me, even if it was small, and whether I'm aware of it or not. Kikaida's legacy and influence for me isn't tied to the show or the stories it told. It was in the fact that this character existed at all in my everyday life in the way he did. Kikaida might be a character no one remembers, someone who had a show that aired on Adult Swim that everyone forgot. To some, his legacy is that of an obscure henshin hero within the tokusatsu canon, one of many that Shotaro Ishinomori created throughout his life. To thousands of kids who grew up in Hawaii, his legacy is that of the world's greatest superhero, one that fought against Dark, Professor Gill, and his evil Getum Guy goons. But for me, Kikaida's legacy came in the form of an action figure I had growing up. That toy is long gone now, and I don't have any photos of it ever existing. But I do have vivid memories of playing with him along with my other toys, even though I didn't know much about who he was or what he did. The only thing I knew was that he was a hero called Kikaida, and that he had a few magic words.
Switch on! 1, 2, 3!
Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it if you've made it this far. I've been working on this video since January, so it's been a long time coming. To see anything I'm up to and extra stuff from this video, you can follow me on Instagram and Twitter. I'm at @itskylrobes, links in the description. There's also a link to a new coffee page for tips. Everything I do here is free, and that's not gonna change, but I am a one-person operation, so if you like what I do and want to support me with $1 or something, you can. You don't have to if you don't want to, or if you don't have the means. Please make sure you take care of yourself before any strangers on the internet. But again, thank you for watching, and thank you for 40,000 subscribers. I really do appreciate all the support.